Let's talk about Tron Legacy. Tron Legacy is a 2010 movie which is a sequel to the original Tron, which came out in 1982. Now, I think I have this in common with a lot of people in my generation when I say that I have a lot of nostalgia for the idea of the original Tron movie, even though I find the original Tron movie to be pretty terrible. Let me explain a little bit. So, when I was a kid, I was hearing a lot about the original Tron movie. It took me some years to track it down. And I think this is partly because it did so terrible upon release that it took a few years before there was any kind of appetite for seeing it again. I knew it existed for a long time before I was able to see it. This was before the internet, or when the internet was still in its infancy, but I was able to glean little bits and pieces about it. I found out that it was made shortly after the original Star Wars. It was one of Disney's gambits to try and catch the Star Wars audience. It was about video games and a guy getting sucked into a video game. And, to a 10-year-old boy, this just all sounded awesome. And then I found out that it had gotten really bad reviews when it first came out, but I thought, well, what do the critics know? I was 10 years old. A lot of my favorite movies were movies that the critics hated. But then and of course the Tron video game. The Tron video game was in arcades at the time. You could get it for the Atari. I think at one point I had the Tron video game for the Atari. The Tron video game was in many ways more successful than the movie was, and perhaps had more of an impact on the 1980s pop culture than the movie did. But yeah, eventually I did finally see the movie sometime in the early 1990s. It was being rerun on the Disney Channel at that stage. And yeah, it was awful. It had bad special effects. I mean, apparently they were groundbreaking for their time, but even at their time, I think the original audience was unimpressed with them largely, and they haven't aged very well since then. The story is just paced terribly slowly. It's badly edited. Plot points are set up, but nothing ever comes of them. Like, for example, in the original Tron movie, they're all afraid of these grid bugs that are going to get them, but then they never actually have a fight with the grid bugs. There's this little flashing ball that answers yes or no, which shows up and then just disappears. One of the other mistakes that the movie makes is it shows its hand way too early. So right at the beginning, you are introduced to the world of the video games, and you are sucked into it and shown all the different games that are on offer here in the world of Tron. The unfortunate result of this, though, is that when you're following the main character, Jeff Bridges, through the world of Tron, and he's being introduced to all these video games for the first time, you as the viewer are like, oh, I've seen this already. I saw this in the opening 5 minutes of the movie. So it's not interesting to me anymore. The movie should have measured out some of these surprises, and they didn't. And then the actual games themselves, the disc game and the speed racing bikes, are largely not interesting. So those are all the problems with the original Tron, but I'm not here to talk about the original Tron today. I'm here to talk about Tron Legacy. So, when it was announced that Disney was doing a sequel to Tron, I think a lot of people reacted to that with amusement. Partly because that sequel was coming out 30 years later, just about 1982 to 2010, so it was a little bit late to be doing a sequel. And largely because I think it's universally agreed that the original Tron was a pretty crappy movie. I mean, I know on the internet being what it is, you can find defenders of the original Tron, but I think the general consensus by both critics and the average person alike is that the original Tron is a rough movie to sit through. So, why do a sequel 30 years later to a movie that wasn't even that great to begin with, a movie that was pretty terrible to begin with, and is remembered for being pretty terrible? Well, to answer my own question, and you all know exactly what I'm going to say here because this is the obvious answer. The reason is because it was a recognizable intellectual property. And we've reached the stage where cashing off of these recognizable intellectual properties is the way that these studios make money. There's the marketing is built in. There's a built-in audience that is going to be curious to see it. And like I said at the beginning of this review, I think me and my generation have nostalgia for the idea of the original Tron. Even though we don't actually like the movie, the concept is something we have nostalgia for. The intellectual property itself, I guess, if not the original movie. Still, despite me knowing the cynical answer for why Disney was doing this, it still struck me as an interesting artistic endeavor to make a sequel to a bad movie. Because quite often, I mean, the usual course of things, right, is there is a good movie because the director and the screenwriter have a vision. They produce their vision successfully in the movie, and then the studio mandates that they do a sequel. And they don't have any ideas for a sequel, so you get some sort of limp, lame sequel coming out that was just mandated by the studio. So quite often the original movie is a work of genius and the sequel is what suffers. But what if you were to take a movie that wasn't very good in the first place and then try and make a sequel that would capture what the original vision for that movie should have been, right? So imagine the studio saying, okay, look, we know this movie wasn't very good. We want another shot at it. Here's what we were trying to do the first time. We think we've done it better this time with the sequel. I mean, that seemed to me what would be the point of doing a Tron sequel. I mean, why else would you do it, huh? I mean, other than to make money. But if there was any artistic vision behind it, it would have been to improve on the vision of the original. Unfortunately, in my opinion, it did not succeed. It was a sequel which was not terribly good to a movie which is not terribly good. So I originally saw Tron Legacy somewhere, I believe it was 2012 when I was in a hotel in Malaysia. And it was free cable in the hotel. And so they were showing the original Tron. So I watched the original Tron, or rewatched it. I hadn't seen it for a good 20 years at that point. It was every bit as terrible as I remembered it. You know, I kind of thought, well, maybe I remember it wrong. Maybe I had such high expectations when I was 12 years old that it was just bound to disappoint my high expectations. If I go in with lower expectations, it will be a better movie. But no. Every bit as terrible as I remembered it. But then, as soon as that movie finished, Tron Legacy was playing right after it. It was, you know, like a double feature on the cable channel that night. So I thought, yeah, I haven't seen Tron Legacy. I'd be curious to see that. So I saw Tron Legacy right after I saw Tron. And just FYI, that's not the way to do it. Because Tron Legacy is just recycling so many of the concepts from the original Tron that you kind of feel that you're watching the same movie twice. I mean, Tron Legacy is better. I mean, in comparison to the original Tron, it's way better. How could it not be? But it's still largely the same movie. It's somebody who's having conflict with the company. They get sucked into the video game, and they do all the same games over again. Now they're amped up. So there's the disc game, but it's like the disc game is now super exciting. Or they do the racing bikes, but the racing bikes are now going faster and there are levels and stuff like that. And it's better, but the original concepts were not that great in the first place. And well, these amped up versions are better. Still kind of the same thing, especially if you watch both movies back to back. Now, after I had watched both movies back to back, I did actually go out and get the DVD of Tron Legacy afterwards. I was living in Cambodia at the time where you could buy a lot of cheap DVDs. And I rewatched it a couple months later, just by itself, not without watching the original Tron first. And Tron Legacy actually is much more watchable if you watch it by itself, without watching the original Tron first. Although I will say this, if you do watch the original Tron and then follow it up immediately with Tron Legacy, even though it's a bit of a slog to sit through both movies, there are some neat nods to continuity that you see. Like the door of the vault is exactly the same in both movies. They did a good job of recreating it. The name of the villain, they have the same family name for the villain in the first movie and then his son in the second movie. Sorry, not the main villain of the movie, but the evil guy in the corporation. They get the actor who plays Alan Bradley, who was a minor character in both movies, comes back. So you do catch those nods to continuity if you see them back to back, but on the whole, I would recommend that you don't see them back to back. So if you do watch Tron Legacy in isolation, it's got some... I didn't really like any of the action scenes. I thought they were largely just a retread of the original. Tron Legacy also has like this airplane racing game, but I'm also going to count that as a variation on the bike racing game. Although, as a side note, I guess it does highlight maybe the difficulties of doing Tron in 2010. Because like back in 1982, there was such a gap between the real world and the video game world, right? The video game world was just this strange world of pixels and light, where you had these bizarre games like Pac-Man and Centipede and stuff like that, which did not resemble real life at all. So the idea of somebody getting sucked into it and existing in this alternate video game universe was something that could catch your imagination. By 2010, we had games like Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto, and other games where they were much more lifelike. So you can't really do the same concept of getting sucked into the video game to the same extent, right? I mean, imagine making a movie about somebody who gets sucked into the Grand Theft Auto game. It would essentially just be any movie about stealing cars, or somebody who gets sucked into Call of Duty. It would essentially just be like any war movie, right? In that sense, I guess Tron kind of had to maybe stick to variations of the games from the original 1982 movie. Either that, or the writers just didn't have any ideas, one or the other. If you watch the commentary on the DVD, And again, I did buy the DVD at one point when I was in Cambodia. They talk a lot about how they updated their concept of Tron for Tron Legacy. So, I mean, the creators were well aware of the fact that by 2010, the technology for video games and computers and stuff like that has increased a lot. And the aesthetics of all that have changed a lot. But their vision of it was that the original Tron grid was cut off from the rest of the internet. So it evolved along its own path. I think the name they use for it on the DVD commentary is a digital Galapagos. So, you know, the mainstream video games are developing elsewhere, but the Tron world is its own little world where it's developing according to its own internal logic. So when you revisit this world in Tron Legacy 30 years later, you see all the concept designs from the original Tron, but they're just updated to look more sleeker, more brighter. And it's a lot of kind of black with white light or orange light around it is the aesthetic they're going for. I found it passably interesting, but not interesting for the whole movie. Now, granted, of course, it's a huge improvement on the original Tron, but again, everything is a huge improvement on the original Tron. But yeah, for Tron Legacy, I don't know. This idea of just kind of black background with white and orange lights started to make me feel a little bit claustrophobic after a while. Like, if I'm going to get immersed in a fantasy world, I'd much rather be in a Tolkien-esque fantasy world, right? Where I've got like these lush green landscapes and these beautiful plants or gorgeous waterfalls or something like that. And I know that's a completely different movie, but you know that's the kind of fantasy world I can immerse myself in for 2 hours and not feel like, oh, okay, I got to get out of this computer box. With Tron Legacy, I felt like at the end of those 2 hours watching the movie that I was ready to get out of this world. It did not hold any attraction for me. Now, as always, take me with a grain of salt, because I've been watching a few other reviews on YouTube before filming this review, and a lot of people said they really liked the aesthetics of Tron Legacy. So this is obviously a personal preference, and perhaps I'm not in the majority of it. And I mean, I can see where the aesthetics of Tron Legacy look pretty cool. I just didn't feel like spending 2 hours in that aesthetics, but that could just be me. While I'm talking about the stuff people really seem to like from Tron Legacy is the soundtrack, which I don't think I even knew this until I was doing some research for this review, but the soundtrack was by Daft Punk, which has a lot of fans and a lot of people really like the soundtrack. I'm going to make a confession. When I was watching the movie, the soundtrack didn't make a huge impression on me. Watching some YouTube videos recently where people were praising the soundtrack, yeah, I guess I could see it a bit. It sounded, I don't know. I'm not a huge Daft Punk fan. It's not my style of music. It was all right. Sorry. So, yeah, I guess that's more or less my review of Tron Legacy. I thought it was all right. I didn't think the action scenes were all that exciting. I thought the world building was okay. I thought the actual world of Tron Legacy was a little bit claustrophobic. It just felt like it was, you know, you're in a computer for too long. I wanted to get out into the real world a bit more. but some people really seem to like it. So, yeah, let me know what you thought of it.